Good morning, Zach. Can you hear us? Good morning, Zach. Can you hear us? That was right.
Anyway, no, that's right. All right. So we're recording, we're streaming.
Yeah.
So it's 9 o'clock and we've got a quorum, so let's get started. I want to start out and say thanks everybody for coming down, appreciate it. And Zach and Brandon online. Zach, I can see you. I'm assuming you can hear us and see us okay? All right, perfect. Real quick, send out an updated agenda. Last night, we did have an item on there about compensation for boards and committees. That was a new House bill that passed last session, but it doesn't play nice with our statutes for GWAC, so we've got some time that we need to ask GOJ which one rules, and so we postponed that one. So if you had printed out your agenda before last night, strike off that. I think it was the second to the last one. I can't remember what it's called. But otherwise, we'll start out with introductions. We've got 4 new folks joining the committee for this year. So let's start out in the room. I'll start with you, Eric.
Eric Schneider, Vice President of Drill Operations for Schneider Water Services, also the current sitting president for the Oregon Groundwater Association.
Richard Smith, grouchy old farmer from the Cooper Mountain Critical Groundwater area, mainly involved with domestic wells. That's my interest.
Dave Noble from Bonanza, Oregon, down Klamath County, and I'm 5th generation rancher and farmer. The rest in water.
Stephen Patton, City of Milton Free Water Public Works. I work with the water system and water rights and water planning in the Walla Walla Basin.
Robin Cook, hydrogeologist at GSI Water Solutions in Portland. We're up here in Salem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jake Stalinka, Fiscal Manager for Water Resources.
Linda Ray, I'm the Administrative Specialist for TSD, GWAC support.
And I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section here at Water Resources. Let's go online to our members. Zach.
Yeah, good morning. Zach Freed, hydrologist and Sustainable Water Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. Calling in from Bend today, and I have to leave a little bit early, so apologize for not seeing y'all in person. I'll catch you next time, and apologize for leaving a little bit early today.
And Brandon.
Brandon Brown, Water Well Developing and Surveys out of Umatilla, Oregon. We're a 4th generation water well contractor.
Great. And we've got 2 other OWRD staff online. Chris.
Good morning, everybody. Chris Bird. I'm the manager of the well construction section here at Water Resources.
And Annette.
Good morning. I'm Annette Lieb. I'm the Technical Services Division Administrator. Thank you for your continued time and commitment to GWAC.
And then maybe just for the new folks, we're also missing 2 members. Ken Bentz out of Crane is a groundwater irrigator, and Chuck Fobert out of Hubbard is a well driller as well. So hopefully they'll be able to join us next time. Beginning of the year, we usually have the agenda looks relatively similar each year. We get a legislative update. We talk about start card fees and get an update on that. And we also select committee chair and co-chair for the year. So we generally ask folks part of the committee. Ask for nominations, but people generally volunteer if they're willing to do it, or nominate their next door neighbor. And I will out Zach and say he has experience as co-chair from last term. So for what that's worth.
And I'll put in a pitch that it's really low lift and really an easy group to So while I'd be happy to serve as chair or co-chair again this year, let's see if anybody else has any really enthusiastic thoughts about this role.
Well, I nominate Zach for chair.
All right.
I'll second it.
All right.
Thanks, Richard. I think.
All right, and then role of the co-chair is basically to help facilitate the meeting if the chair can't attend. So any nominations or volunteers for co-chair?
I'll do that.
All right. Anybody second Richard's nomination?
I'll second it.
All right, thanks, Steve. I guess we need to vote on these. So first for chair, Richard nominated Zach and Dave seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, excellent. And for co-chair, Richard volunteered or nominated himself and Steve seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? All right, perfect. In that case, Zach, I'll turn it over to you. And when you have to leave early, I will pass it to Richard.
Wonderful. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate the backup. Well, let's see. Next up on the agenda, we have the approval of September and December 2024 meeting summaries. Justin sent those out by email. I looked them through. I did not have any comments or concerns. Before we move to approve, is there any discussion? Did anybody else have any suggestions, comments, questions, or concerns about the meeting minutes? Not hearing any. Is there a motion to approve the meeting summaries?
I'll make a motion to approve them as presented.
Wonderful.
Second.
All right, great. Thank you all.
All right.
And I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule here, but is Bryn around and available for the legislative update, or Justin, do we have to kill some time?
Well, first of all, just to be on the up and up, everybody that's in favor of approving the minutes?
Oh, yes, thank you. We have to vote on the approval. Yep, great. See, this is what you get when you nominate me as chair, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry/thanks. Anybody opposed to the approval? No. Okay, great.
All right. So let's see. I know that Bryn had a previous meeting that ended at 9:15, and I guess looking through the agenda, given that Jake is here now, maybe we could swap that up top.
Yeah, sounds good. Jake, are you available and ready to do the start card fee update?
Sure.
Wonderful. Over to you.
All right. And I said I would help get that presentation up on the screen. So give me 1 second here. Okay.
All right. Okay. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay. So I just want to give a quick overview to start cards overall. So start cards, section ORS 537.762. Section 13 states that the start card fee revenue shall be paid into the Water Resources Department operating fund and can be used to pay the cost of the department to employ personnel to inspect wells and well construction. Moving on to ORS 537.763, that actually establishes the Water Resources Operating Fund, and it further defines the use of this fund to provide for the payment of the administrative expenses of the Water Resources Commission in carrying out the provisions of 537.762. Section 4 of 762 sets the biennial limitations on the expenditures in the Water Resources Operating Fund, and these limitations are what you see on the screen there. So administration not more than 5%, technical not more than 20%, and field and enforcement not less than 75%. So these are the statutory limits that we have to spend on each of the sections from the funds that are deposited, or from the monies that are deposited to that fund. So, in addition to those limits of expenditures from a division perspective, the fee is also set in ORS 537.762 in section 12. Currently, that fee is established at $350, and that was effective January 1st, 2022, as a result of House Bill 2145 being passed in the 2021 legislature. So up on the screen here, you can see the historical rates of those fees over time. I've also put on there what is currently under consideration in the governor's recommended budget, which proposes a $490 start card fee effective July 1st, 2025. That fee is being proposed as part of House Bill 2808, as well as Legislative Concept 402. So currently, for the current biennium of 23-25, the start card revenue total is projected to be about less than just under 0.8% of the total department budget. When we look forward to 25-27, at current service level, this would translate into about 0.9% of the total budget for the department. So that's at the present fee of $350. If we look at how that would affect it for the governor's recommended budget with the fee increase up to $490, that would represent about 1.1% of the total department budget. I will note that, historically, when we look back a couple bienniums ago, in 21-23, start card revenues were about 1.1% of the total department budget. So this actually gets us closer to what we were in 21-23. For the most part, start card fees are related to positions. So admin funds about 0.98 FTEs, so just under one full. It's made up of 5 different positions. Technical funds, 1.0 FTE, which is a data tech position for the department. It's a water resource data technician. And then field and enforcement funds, 8.9 FTE positions, and a portion of the enforcement manager position. In addition to this, we also have 2 well inspector positions that are funded with general fund. And additionally, the department does have its water masters fill in when and where necessary to do well inspections. Kind of varies from year to year. And water masters are also paid by the state's general fund. So there is some additional general fund support that goes into this program in addition to the fees. All right. So this chart here shows the historical count of start cards. One note, I know that I think there may have been some other information published by year from Chris or by Justin, and these numbers might differ slightly from that because from a fiscal perspective, we're looking at things from a fiscal year. So this is really reflective of that fiscal year, not necessarily a calendar year, which might be some information that you've received previously. So these really reflect when the revenue is deposited into the operating fund by fiscal year, which runs July through June. The monitor wells are shown in blue, and the water wells are shown in brown on the graph. Over the last 3 years, we've been averaging about 3,200 start cards annually. Right now, we are projecting going forward to project about 3,100 wells per fiscal year starting. for the remainder of this biennium and close out this biennium, and then as well as into the future. So, you know, and historically monitored wells make up about 12 to 13% of the total wells each fiscal year. So we're expecting that trend to largely continue. All right. So, start card fund balance projections, we have, in accounting, the best practice is to carry over an ending fund balance and to start the biennium. Basically, if whatever we end one biennium with, that's the end funding balance, that becomes your beginning fund balance. And the main purpose of this is to smooth out our cash flows. You know, as you know, start card revenue is not, it's not a constant, even stream of cash flow coming in. So having that balance that really acts as a buffer to allow us to continue to pay expenses based on various seasonality. In 2021, the start card, we did have a start card increase in 2021, and that increase did incorporate a small portion of the ending fund balance to support the program, but with the fee increase that's being proposed in the 25-27 GRB, that's the first time that the fee increase is reflective of fully incorporating that total ending fund balance into our projections in order to try to really smooth out that cash flow and make sure that the program remains solvent in its present form. So, you know, expenditures have been increasing over the past biennium, driven both by COLA increases as well as inflationary increases that have impacted benefits, other expenditures. Up on the screen here, you can see where our ending fund balance is projected to end at the end of this biennium, which is $1,084,656. The middle column is the current service level. So this is assuming that no fee increase occurs. Then we would end this biennium with just over $200,000 in our ending fund balance to start the next biennium. That would, you know, based on that, you know, we're projecting that we would have revenue shortfalls by sometime by 25, or sorry, by sometime 27, 29 biennium. If we look at the last column there for the governor's recommended budget with the fee increase, then you can see we get back to a more healthy level of that ending fund balance. All right, so so this next chart just shows over time our revenue versus expenses. So you can see there was a fee increase that occurred in 2022 with House Bill 2145, and you can see that jump in revenue relative to expenses in that 21-23 year. And then as our expenses have gone up, that's where you see that, you know, that fee increase helped buffer those expenses going into this biennium. And then also just a comparison of what that revenue versus expenses would look like at current service level versus the governor's recommended budget. And then finally, just to go back to and touch on ORS 537763, Section 4, which speaks to the expenditures by division. This is just a historical view of where those dollars have gone. So you can see most of it has consistently gone to field enforcement. We've never dropped below that 75%, which is statutorily required, and we haven't exceeded any of the other division statutory requirements. There are some years, 17 through 23, where you can see there have been far fewer expenditures in by division, and this is driven by vacancies that we just, you know, we didn't have the positions filled, and consequently we were not spending fee dollars on in those areas. That's it. Any questions?
Thanks, Jake. Any questions or discussion from the committee? All right, not hearing any right now. Recognizing that this is like an annual discussion, Jake, is there do you have any questions or prompts for us as a committee that would be useful to provide feedback or input to you?
Not at this time. I think if there's anything that, that the committee would find valuable for me to bring, with these reports, if there's some additional information in the future for the next time around, I'd be interested in knowing that. I just want to make sure that the information I provide is useful and helpful.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, so far so good. I suppose pending the outcomes of what the budget ends up looking like and whether that fee increase goes forward, it might be useful to have a future discussion, follow-up discussion with you about how those revenues and expenses look, especially if the fee increase does not move forward in that scenario.
Sure.
I have a quick question. Do they typically go through as requested, or is there a variability in what you request versus what ends up happening?
Are you talking about the fee increase?
Yeah.
I mean, that ultimately is really up to the legislature. So I will defer. I mean, is Bryn on? Yeah, I think Bryn might be able to speak. Yeah, Bryn might be able to speak to that a little more effectively than I can.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bryn Hudson. I'm the legislative coordinator for the department. I apologize. I didn't see who asked that question in the room. But yeah, Jake is right. That really is up to the legislature. In the last kind of 6 years that I've been here, the legislature has approved the department fee bills as proposed. However, that is not to say that they will continue to do so. Just like WRD, there are many, many agencies enterprise-wide that are also considering fee increases. So it really will depend on kind of how the legislature views our fees in the context of all the other fees and what the general fund outlook looks like. Sometimes we'll see committees supplementing fee increases with more general fund. Sometimes they'll just pass fees as they exist. It really is up to the legislature to decide what they're going to do with that. And I can get into kind of where things are at in the process and when we will all be able to know more when I do my legislative update. And kind of give you some understanding of when you can expect to know the definitive answer or the partially definitive answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks, Bryn. We've got you set up for next on the agenda, but I guess follow-up question, Jake. So it sounds like I just want to check my understanding. Is it correct that even if the fee increase did not move forward, the FTE, it would still be okay, it would still be safe and secure for this biennium, but there would be potential issues that you're projecting out for the next biennium. Is that correct?
For this biennium, for 23-25, that would be correct.
Okay, and then the 25-27 biennium, is that FTE at risk?
Potentially, I would say that it would be cutting it close. It really depends on, there are a lot of assumptions that have gone into those projections. And with, when you look at an ending fund balance of only $200,000, a lot of things have to go exactly to plan from an expenditure projection perspective in order to come in at that 200,000. So theoretically, yes, but a lot of things need to come in as planned. We still see we're in a little bit of an inflationary environment. We've built in inflation, into those projections as best we can. That said, it still is a little bit of an unknown. So there's definitely an element of risk.
Got it. Thank you. Any other questions for Jake? Okay. Well, thanks, Jake. Really appreciate you taking the time to give us that update.
Thank you.
Justin, shall we move along to Bryn's agenda item, or do you want to take us somewhere else?
Nope, that sounds great.
All right. Bryn, welcome in. Thanks for introducing yourself already, and over to you.
Awesome, great, thanks so much. So again, hi everybody, Bryn Hudson, Legislative Coordinator for the department. I am here to give a really brief legislative update. There's quite a bit going on, and I've found with these types of updates, it's better to keep things short and sweet and provide some space for you all to ask questions if there are any. So I will start kind of with the general overview of where we are at and kind of the lay of the land, and then some budget updates, and then I've got a couple general areas of legislation that I'll just flag. There are some themes that we're seeing, so I think that might be helpful in kind of helping you all understand what the major topics that are being addressed that relate to groundwater and all of y'all's area of kind of interest there. So we are in what we call the long legislative session. So we have two types of sessions in Oregon. We have a short session that happens in even numbered years, and a long session that happens in odd numbered years. So the 2025 long session started on January 21st, and we anticipate that we will run all the way to the end of June. So we're at about 8 weeks of 23, so about a third of the way through at this point in time. We are still in what we call the first chamber, within the first chamber deadline, which means all the bills that have been introduced are still in the process of receiving their first public hearing, potentially being worked to move on to the next committee or the Joint Ways and Means Committee if they need appropriations. But there is still quite a bit of legislation that is up in the air at the moment. So just to give you all a little bit of perspective, we're tracking more than 600 different pieces of legislation right now. Not all of those are specifically impacting WRD, there quite a bit are. But it's anything from statewide HR bills, procurement, rulemaking bills, bills that maybe impact our sister natural resource agencies that we would potentially be partner to that work or support that work, or WRD bills specifically that impact the work that we do. So it's really a wide sweeping range of legislation that we're tracking. Bills, the first kind of major deadline to keep your eye out for will be April 9th. That is the date by which bills, there's a caveat here, bills in the Rules Committee and bills in the Joint Ways and Means Committee do not follow this rule. But in general, most bills that we are tracking follow this rule. If they have not moved out of their original committee by April 9th, the committee that they were introduced into, they died. They're gone. We don't track them anymore. And they haven't made it through session. So a lot of the bills, typically what we see is about half the bills will drop off. So we'll go from about 600 bills being tracked to around 300 or 400 bills. And then there's always the off chance that maybe a bill that dies, that concept might pop up in another bill later in session. So we always try to keep an eye out for all of those topics so that we kind of are apprised to what's going on. I am working on getting a staff report thrown together for our commission that has a list of not all 600 bills, because I don't think anybody except for me needs to see that or wants to see that. But it's about 200 or so of the most relevant bills that we are watching pretty closely. That just kind of gives an update as to the bill number, where they are, and then like a really high level summary. So once we have completed that for our commission, I will be sure to send that over to Justin for those of you who are interested in really digging into those legislative pieces. Long sessions is also when agency biennial budgets are developed and adopted by the legislature. So the department had our hearing on our budget in front of the Joint Ways and Means Natural Resources Subcommittee on the 18th of February. So that is where the Director Gall and then our deputy directors provided an overview of what the agency does, some of the work that we are engaged in, what the emerging or driving issues for our budgets is, what policy option packages or new investments are proposed in the governor's recommended budget. And then that bill will, if history repeats itself, will hang out in that Ways and Means Committee for a few months. And then at some point, likely in April, May, June, if we're going to be going a little bit later, The committee will add to our budget, take from our budget, whatever they decide to do. And then that will pass it and it'll go to Joint Ways and Means full committee for a vote, and hopefully pass. So typically these committees will like to hear all of the agencies that are that have their budget bills within that committee. And then they will also receive a litany of policy bills that have a fiscal impact that impact the agency's budget. And so usually what they like to do is get all the legislation in front of them and then pick and choose which pieces of legislation and which components of the budget fit together and then pass that out collectively. There are opportunities for a few other odds and ends, but typically the committee likes to kind of see the full lay of the land for the most part, and then pass the budget with all of those other concepts in mind. In terms of items within the budget that this group is most likely interested in, I will remind folks that the department was given a $1 million general fund cap in terms of what new general fund appropriation we were able to ask for. So our budget is relatively modest in terms of new general fund investment. I will note that there is $1 million in the general fund for the well abandonment repair and replacement fund, which is, we love to see that, that's great. And then for the most part, the main kind of pieces of our budget that we will talk to when we talk about legislation are our fee bills, and then lottery bond revenue for our funding programs. And then there's a few general funded staff really focused on IT and web accessibility at the agency. So that was a theme in our budget this year. So there's a couple packages that collectively shake out to about 1.5 positions really aimed at modernizing IT systems, being more strategic with our IT governance, and then providing some capacity to update and maintain our website to make it a little more publicly accessible and ensure that folks that are looking for information from the department can actually get it. So that's the budget side. From the legislative perspective, there is quite a bit going on. I think I remember coming to you all in 2023 and wiping my brow and saying, woo, we're busy. We are even busier this session. There is a lot of interest going on in water, which is wonderful. We love to see that. I'll start with just a reminder. The department has 4 pieces of legislation. 2 of those are fee bills. So Zach queued up. Zach, I'm sorry. I'm looking at Zach. Jake queued up. Jake queued up the start card and the well construction fees. So I won't belabor that too much. That is House Bill 2808. That is currently sitting in the House Ag, Land Use, Natural Resources and Water Committee. Most of these bills are starting on the House side and are in committee. We're trying to be streamlined in how you're operating the legislative session. Most of the stuff is starting in the House and that committee. We also have another fee bill that has to do with dam safety and water right transactions. I think last time I was here, I gave folks a briefing of the ins and outs of all of those bills, so I won't belabor that because there's a lot of pieces, but I also have a summary document that I will send over to Justin with what's in our budget, what our legislation looks like. But those 2 fee bills are really kind of a high priority for us right now in terms of getting those scheduled for a public hearing and getting those in front of the committee for consideration. Right now, we are anticipating that those bills may be heard end of March, like March 24th, March 31st time period. Again, everything is very fluid, so don't quote me on those dates. They have yet to be scheduled, but that's, if you're kind of on the lookout for when you might see those up in that committee, that is when those bills are slated for potential public hearing. I will also note there is another bill that is not a department bill, but is probably of interest to this group, which is House Bill 2165, which is a committee bill, and it seeks to provide some one-time general fund to offset the start card fee revenue shortfall. So I just wanted to flag that. Not a department bill, but it is relevant to our fee supported programs. My understanding is the committee is hoping to have a public hearing with all 3 of those bills on the same day so that they can kind of consider them all in their breath. So just a heads up on fees. The other two department bills are pretty regionally specific. One has to do with the sunset of the temporary transfers and leases for determined claims down in the Klamath Basin. That one's pretty straightforward. It's the sunset repeal bill, so I won't belabor that one. The other one has to do with the Harney Conservation Reserve Enhancement Fund, and that bill is a technical fix to ensure that unspent funds within that program are kept and can be built upon so that we can have more flexibility to enroll more donors in the CREP program. That bill has passed out of committee with amendments. The amendments were essentially to expand the authority to allow the department to pursue CREP statewide in areas where we are no longer issuing irrigation rights for groundwater irrigation rights. But the $500,000 is maintained for Harney. So the authority is expanded, but the resources that are appropriated still are kept within the Harney realm. So that's just a point to note. And just a little bit of background on CREP for those of you who may be unfamiliar. CREP will take quite a while to establish. So it's the goal of this is our understanding from Representative Owens is just to essentially get the authority so that in the event that other basins start exploring the possibility of CREP or the department begins exploring the possibility of doing CREP, we've got the authority and that's not a barrier to entry to pursuing that program in other areas of the state, but there are a litany of criteria and studies that need to be done in order to get there. So you will likely know about it before it becomes available to a neighborhood near you. So those are department bills. I'll highlight that there are two other pieces of relevant legislation that are governor's kind of priority bills. Those are in the Senate side, and those numbers, oh goodness, sorry, I'm scrolling through my list of 300 bills. Those bills are Senate Bill 1153 and Senate Bill 1154. One of those is directly related to groundwater quality. I believe that is 1154. And WRD is implicated in this bill, but it is largely a water quality bill and really aims at creating a more transparent and proactive groundwater quality management framework. I'm not going to speak too heavily on that one. I've been pretty out of the loop on that, and it's not, again, WRD is kind of like a side entity, but it will be included in the summary if you're interested in learning more. And then the other bill, 1153, is a kind of a nice segue into another general kind of thematic clump that we're seeing, which is transfers, water right transfers, not just related to groundwater, but collectively. 1153 is a bill that looks to incorporating some kind of consideration for in-stream habitat, sensitive, threatened, and endangered aquatic species into transfers review. There's also a variety of bills both on the House side and the Senate side that propose an array of new or limit what can be considered in a transfer. So there is quite a vibrant conversation going on around that we will continue to see. My anticipation is that conversation will not be concluded in the next month or so. I think that will likely be a session-long topic that folks are engaged in. Another general area is really around program modernization. I won't throw the bill numbers out because there's just kind of too many to keep track of. But modernization of WRD programs and processes is also a big theme, which is exciting to see that there is interest. So in addition to the fee bills, Representatives Hellman Owen and the Water Caucus also have a litany of modernization bills that have to deal with streamlining and modernizing the water right transaction process, reforming the contested case process. So when proposed final orders are protested, what happens after that, and trying to streamline that process. There is some legislation to modernize and improve interagency coordination on things like water reuse and aquifer recharge programs, both at WRD and in concert with other agencies. And then there's also some legislation to streamline the department's water project funding programs. So feasibility study grants and water project grants and loans. The last kind of set of bills I will highlight are a few very pointed groundwater bills originating from Harney conversations. So there are a few bills around Harney groundwater management and kind of elevating some of the conversations that are happening in the Division 512 rulemaking. There's also it's formed up as a statewide bill, but it also is really originating from a lot of the conversations going on around voluntary groundwater agreements in the Harney. That's also a bill that we are tracking and providing technical expertise on. And then another bill that I believe is a statewide bill, but is being driven by the Harney is a true study bill that actually has gone to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, but it's looking at studying options and potential risks and benefits of siting energy facilities in critical groundwater areas. So that one's just more of a study preliminary analysis bill, but if that does get resources and moves forward, I anticipate that the department will be a partner to DLCD on that legislation and that work. So there are many, many other bills. I am going to stop talking though and see if there are any other specific questions or other pieces of legislation that folks have questions about. Those are just the pieces of legislation that we anticipate are going to get at least conversations. There's a lot of bills that we don't actually know what's happening. That's not to say that if I didn't highlight it, it's not going anywhere, but just kind of highlighting what we anticipate is going to be getting in conversation. So we wanted you all to be aware of it. But with that, I'm free to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryn. I think you took us through at least 50 of that 600 bill list. And thanks, Linda and Justin, for muting the microphone. There's a little bit of noise coming through from the room. Can you guys unmute the microphone now? Wonderful. Thank you. You're on top of it. Committee, surely there's some questions about that immense amount of information that Bryn just laid on us. So what questions do you have for Bryn?
Bryn, do you have any information on 3419?
3419. Is that the measurement and reporting bill?
Yes.
Yes. So that bill had a hearing, I want to say a few weeks ago, in the House Ag Committee. So the next step for that bill, if the committee decides to move it forward, would be to have a work session and consider any potential amendments. I have not heard any rumors or rumblings, and I don't have any information on whether or not the committee intends to work that bill or introduce amendments. We have not seen any amendments. So we are kind of in a holding pattern on that one in terms of where that one stays.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I see some head shakes. Well, Bryn, you briefly touched upon, I've got a question, I guess. Bryn, you briefly touched upon the governor's recommended budget, and this committee very briefly talked about the proposed GRB reductions for groundwater things in the package 090, I think. Wonderful, thank you for the head nod. And so I'm just curious, you said that there was the February hearing for the Water Resource Department budget. Is there any further discussion or is there any further conversation about I think there were specifically reductions proposed in the governor's budget for groundwater studies and I want to say for monitoring wells or evapotranspiration, something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I feel like that's relevant for this committee.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So yes, so there are a suite of proposed reductions in the governor's recommended budget. There are a few other things, but if I recall just off the top of my head, most of it is related to data collection. So it's groundwater studies, monitoring wells, stream gauges, ET, evapotranspiration, agromet, stuff like that. So what will happen, we had some questions on that from Representative Owens specifically during our budget hearing. And so just as a reminder, those are proposed cuts. Nothing is a done deal, as well as any additions to our budget is a proposed addition, is not a done deal. So right now the committee will be considering whether or not to adopt those reductions, whether or not to add them back in either fully or partially. There is a piece of legislation that was, I believe it got scheduled and then for a public hearing and then unscheduled. But I believe it's 3575 is a House bill, 3573. Pardon me for misquoting. 3573 was a bill that came from Hellman Owens. You'll notice the pattern. Those two are really, really active in the water world. That was going to be up for public hearing. And what that bill did is it restored the data components within that reduction package. It was pulled. But again, the Joint Ways and Means Committee doesn't really need a piece of legislation to restore funding. So at the end of the day, just because that bill got pulled does not mean that adding those items back in is off the table. The big pieces that this group likely cares about of kind of what's in that bill and then what's also in those reductions is resources for groundwater studies. So the work that we did in Harney, the work that's ongoing in the Walla Walla, money to do cost share with the USGS and do data collection in order to round out those groundwater studies. If we have less money, it just takes longer to do that work and we're doing fewer of them. Other cuts would be money for groundwater monitoring wells. So strategically drilling wells in order to get more information about what's happening to groundwater resources in a given area. We don't have resources for that. We are limited in the amount of strategic data that we can collect. And so then we rely on other sources. So other privately held wells and things like that. And then modeling to fill in the data gaps. Those are kind of some of the things that are on the table for cuts. And then that is also to say that to some legislators who actually do sit on that Ways and Means Committee, there has been some talk about trying to find some space in the bottle per se for restoration of these funds. But again, that is ultimately up to the decision of the Joint Ways and Means Committee. So we will be waiting to see what they decide.
Got it. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the committee? You guys all feel pretty comfortable with the whole Ways and Means process, the Rules Committee, all that good stuff? You know what's going on? Because I sure don't. All right. Well, Bryn, we're looking forward to seeing that staff report. Thanks for being willing to share that summary with the Groundwater Advisory Committee. I think there will be a lot more to learn in there, a lot more to scratch my head at. With that, I think we will move on to our next agenda item. Thanks again, Bryn, for being here. Justin, should we move over to the backflow prevention device requirements in the Umatilla with Chris?
Yes, that sounds great.
Great. Chris, just before you get started, one just point of logistics. Nothing personal, Chris. I'm interested in the Umatilla. I will have to drop off the call in about 12 minutes or so. So Richard, would you be okay taking over the organization chair duties and all that good stuff for the rest of the meeting?
I'm not nearly as proficient as you, but I'm happy to do it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, great. In that case, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Zach. Good to see you. I'm in the same boat as Zach. I have to drop off at 10, but I'm going to leave you in the very capable hands of Tessa if we're not through our presentation by then. So good morning, everybody. Great to virtually see you. For those that I don't know, my name is Chris Goitz. I'm the North Central Region Manager here in Pendleton. And kick over to Tessa to introduce. I won't introduce you, Tessa.
Good morning, everybody. Tessa Wilburn, Assistant Water Master in the Pendleton region, working for Chris, and Sean, Finn, and I are sort of working on this backflow prevention rollout together with Chris. And then I don't know, Chris, whenever you're ready to share or start the screen. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. We have a short presentation to go through, and the missing member of our team is Sean Finn, so he's our well inspector here for the North Central region. So Sean and Tessa have really been doing a lot of the behind the scenes and on the ground work, and I just get to talk about it. So so we're here today to talk about our work around backflow or back siphon prevention. And we're really focusing in on a particular geography here in the North Central region. So Tessa, if you could go to the next slide. So the Lower Umatilla groundwater management area has been a GWAMA since the early 90s. Nitrate is the contaminant of concern in this area. Around, let's see, 3 or 4 years ago, this really was brought more into the public light after Morrow County declared a groundwater emergency. That put into motion a number of things, including for us here at the Water Resources Department, the governor's direction for the agencies to develop a plan to reduce nitrate in this area. So we've worked very closely with our friends at DEQ and Department of Ag, alongside Oregon Health Authority, who's been doing more of the on-the-ground kind of water delivery work to develop a nitrate reduction plan for the state of Oregon that was published last fall. It is housed on DEQ's website. If you are interested in a short 150-page read, details the work that the state agencies are doing in this space. One thing that is within our authority is backflow prevention. And so while that wasn't incorporated initially into the nitrate reduction plan, it will be incorporated in 2025 now that we have this program off the ground and we're doing work in this space. So let's go to the next slide. So backflow prevention or back siphon prevention, in its simplest form, prevents fertilizer or chemicals from flowing backwards from an irrigation system into the well. We use chemigation and fertigation kind of interchangeably. We know they're not the same, but I think the point is that you're injecting a substance into your irrigation system, and if that system loses pressure or the pressure is imbalanced, that can result in that chemical or fertilizer that has been injected to flow into the groundwater system. There's the FRIFRA, for those who love a good acronym. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act is kind of where this is rooted. The state has actually had rules on the books since the mid-90s relative to backflow prevention. I believe, and Mr. Bird can correct me if I'm misremembering, but those rules were slightly modified last in the late 20-teens. I don't remember the year off the top of my head. But this is our first kind of broad landscape level effort to focus on backflow. It's been more of a singular issue for us in the past. So this is the first time that we're really looking at a broad landscape and focusing on backflow prevention. Next slide. So just nomenclature terminology slide here. So there's 2 things. Again, we use these interchangeably. They are slightly different. So back siphon or back pressure. You can see I'm not going to read this slide to you, but just so we are kind of on the same page with what we're talking about. There's kind of 2 phenomenon that can happen in an irrigation system that would result in chemicals or fertilizer flowing the wrong direction and potentially back into the groundwater system. So this slide is just there for some terminology. Next slide. And then this is the kind of legal foundation that we're working in. So Again, if you're suffering from some insomnia, recommend that you pull up some of these rules and read through them. The rule for us at the department is in the well construction rule, so 215 and then specifically 0017. If you want to read it's relatively lengthy. There's quite a bit of information in the rules. And then the statutory authorization is in 537-780. We have been asked what we're doing about surface water. We like to make things cumbersome bureaucratically, and so the surface water backflow prevention would actually be under the Department of Ag's Agricultural Water Quality Program, which restricts or prohibits the contamination of waters of the state. So if you had a surface water system that you are applying chemicals or fertilizer into, and that was able to flow backwards into waters of the state, you'd be violating the Ag Water Quality Program. Tessa and Sean and I did go to the state of Idaho last fall and met with their Department of Ag. Backflow, back siphon prevention is solely within the authority of the Department of Ag in Idaho, but they gave us a great tour. We learned a ton from them, and we're trying to take what we learned from our friends in Idaho and incorporate that in our rollout of the program here in the Umatilla. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Tessa. She's going to get into some of the particulars and then kind of where we're headed from here. So thank you.
Important note, though, if you have burning questions that are really hard, now's the time to get to Chris. Before he leaves. So this is the schematic of what we're expecting and as far as our regulation purposes. There's a lot of different nuances you can go into what you're going to require on these. However, in rules, we're asking that they have the air vacuum relief on top with a low pressure drain. All of them need to have this Kim check valve, and then of course the part for the interlocking irrigation pump, so that actually where the chemicals are being injected into mostly the pivots. The idea is that if there's any pressure lost on the pivot themselves, that this pump would turn off automatically. But as far as what we're inspecting for the majority of the time is to see that they have this check valve, the air vacuum relief on top, the low pressure drain, and a hose that leads 20 feet away down gradient, so that in case there is a backflow, back siphon event, the water that's left behind can dissipate. So the nice thing is what we're finding, well, in general, most of the systems in the lower Umatilla do not have a complete backflow system. That's definitely different around just in our little area, depending on the irrigation supply companies. So for instance, Milton Free Water, they really push a backflow siphon or backflow prevention program. But not in the lower Umatilla so much. So what we're seeing usually is, I guess I should clarify too, that anything under 4 inches has a different, they usually are more of the PR assembly, the pressure reducing one. And we don't see this often enough because irrigation supply lines are usually much larger than 4 inches. So this would be for systems that are smaller, home systems possibly. So I think under 4 inches has just a little bit different regulations on that one, the RP program. So the components, like I said earlier, that we're really looking for and what you guys will be familiar with seeing, well, some of you, because I actually have found out that many people have no idea what a backflow device is. I didn't tell Mr. Woodcock reined me in on this project. So you'll have the air vent and the inspection port. The idea is the inspection port on top. Here, this will allow you to see and check on the valves, make sure that they're continuing to work. This is what all of us typically see out there, is this basic wafer valve. And so the nice thing on these systems in general, it's beneficial to the irrigator to have the check valve in place for the pressurizing their system. So pretty much all the systems have had this, but we're looking that they also have the air vent. Also, of course, they have to have the air vent to pressurize their system as well, so that everything doesn't collapse. It's not usually always in the right spot is the bigger issue. And then the low pressure drain, and then the injection line check valves, where they actually inject into the pivot or into the right near the well. Again, most of the time it's at the pivot. or what they have, these fun things called clusters, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, gigantic clusters where they pull from all sites and inject there as well. So the one in the middle is like an all-in-one unit that is common, and then they also have the option to put together a system that works if they only have a check valve. And they've got some people working with us to get those approved. Again, probably something you guys are very common with. This is what we typically see in the LUB is LUB-GWAMA, is this check valve. Again, beneficial for them because they pressurize their system. And then what we're asking for is that behind the check valve and to the pump, that they have this air vent and an inspection port and then a low pressure drain. These are also, so this is single, like multiple pieces, this wafer check valve. Our local solution, a local irrigator supply company came up with this one after our meeting. We had an outreach meeting. He came up with this and has been installing them pretty regularly in this area. And then these Geen Clemens and Pierce are just examples of all-in-one units where they have the inspection ports and the valves all in one piece. But what you guys will probably notice, and what we get a lot of probably pushback on the most, is this might be a little hard to see in this picture, but the low pressure drain. If they have all the rest of the components, they don't have the low pressure drain. They like to plug it with a valve. So sort of offsets the purpose of having a drain. But this is probably one of our number one issues that we're trying to get them to work on. And so far it's been good, but it's usually broken or they put some sort of valve. The idea that if it does come back, it'll relieve that pressure and get rid of anything left in the line and not go back in the well. So what our program so far has looked like is we did some creating of field maps, and survey 1, 2, 3 is how we're going to do our site visits. Again, give a lot of credit to Sean. He's the brainchild behind a lot of putting this together. When we're going out there, we're looking for the status of the fertigation and chemigation, if they have the backflow set up and all the points, all the required components, and then location, and also to help with groundwater and well compliance. We are trying to get a good well ID location on several of these places with accurate lat and longs. Some are still, we're just like in the quarter somewhere. And so trying to get that information better just for our tracking and mapping systems and data tracking. So those are being collected while we're on site. And then as far as what compliance looks like is if they have the component and at any point and they're not fertigating or chemigating, they're good. We map it, we collect the data. Non-compliance, what that looks like is they don't have a backflow system or even a complete one, because some of them will have part of it. They don't have a complete system. And then they have chemigation and fertigation hooked up at the time. They're in non-compliance. We note it. We're going to be leaving cards for them, sort of like a yellow card version, but not with any authority on there. Just a, hey, this is what's happening. If we come back again, you will get a notice of violation. So all they have to do to become into compliance is remove the fertigation and chemigation, because the rules are not set for any irrigation purposes, which is nice for them because they can continue to irrigate as long as they remove all fertigation and chemigation, which in some of these instances isn't the best option, but at least they're not losing their water. What non-compliance also looks like is they have fertigation chemigation conveniently set up there, and then the lines are not attached. We just let them know if at any point they become attached, you will receive a notice of violation. That's after initial inspection, and we see all that and we let them know on site. So that's a little bit like of what our compliance looks like. So in our LUB-GWAMA area, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but we did a risk query and we got about 792 groundwater right holders, narrowed that down through a lot of man hours to 425 people that would have, getting rid of people that have multiple rights and erroneous ones that maybe don't pertain, they have a municipal. So 425 recipients of a letter that went out saying, this is our program. This is what we're going to be looking for. And then we also had an outreach flyer in there to say, please come learn more about this. And so then we also update the website. We have a frequently asked question page, a one pager for information that goes in all those mailings. Let them know this is what it looks like. These are the components. This is the deadline. And then we also had outreach event, which was great because Doug and Ivan both attended and gave a good presentation. Had some good questions there. And if you're interested in seeing that presentation, it's recorded and on the website. And then we did just recently another one saying of the 425, 294 of you have not responded. And then we've been getting some more of those. And the other thing that has been great is we've been, the bigger irrigation outfits and ranches and farmers have been reaching out to us and saying, can you please come inspect now? Or they had Sean and I come out and do a pre-inspection and say, what do we need to come into compliance before we purchase all this stuff or tear our system apart? And so we've been working with them recently and approving it so they can get their systems online because irrigation season has begun in Guama. Most of the chemigation, though, and fertigation is what we understand from the farmers is it will not start till April or May. So keeping track of that, we decided to base it off of the POA, because that's ultimately what we're trying to protect is the groundwater. It becomes a little bit of a nightmare, as you guys are familiar with. So many pivots off of one well, or like I said, the clusters, and we went back and forth on how to necessarily best regulate this, and we decided on the POA. It helps protect the groundwater source, and trying to track down pivots in this area would be a whole nother job on its own for every single POA. So we did that, and we're basing off of that. And that also helps with well compliance a little bit. We're not doing a full well inspection. You know, we're not, Sean is the well inspector. I am not trained for that by any means, but we're doing, I guess what you call it, like a holistic one, where if it's egregious issues, we'll address those first before we address a backflow issue. But doing an inspection, making sure that everything is on board there. And also, like I said, taking the lat long and trying to improve our understanding where all these wells are. And there's new wells and new construction that we're dealing with all the time. So we're in the middle right now of sort of early irrigation, pre-installation. Technically, there's nobody that would be in, well, I cautiously say that in general, there will not be anybody in non-compliance because they're not fertigating or chemigating. Remember that it's only that piece that puts them out of non-compliance. And then of course we just have some resources and different things for this was geared when we were doing the presentation for the outreach event. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell. You guys have any questions? If so, I'll give them to Chris.
Okay.
So have you run this long enough to get any results? Is it helping the contamination?
No, we have not run this long enough for that, because this is the first irrigation season we're implementing it fully.
I guess, Tessa, how far along are you in your initial inspections?
So of the 425 that we have to do, we're really in preliminary on the inspections, and those are I would say we have, like only maybe like 25 that are, hey, we're done, we're ready to go. As you can understand, some of these outfits would like to get started really early because their systems, this one gentleman said they're about $3,000 to $4,000 every time they start and stop their systems. So they've been reaching out to us. But other than that, we can't really do full inspections until there's active chemigation and fertigation because in general, they're in compliance. However, if they would like to know ahead of time, we're happy to go out and let them know, like, this is what you have to do to become into compliance.
Gotcha. And so that you mentioned would start April, May, likely.
Yeah. I mean, the ones that say we're going to chemigate, we're going to fertigate, check our system. We're trying to get done as fast as possible. That's just on them when they actually have a little bit, as you can imagine, a little bit of a back order, and lack of welders that can do all the system repairs. So yeah, full enforcement or checking will be April and May, June.
Thank you.
I have a little something, more of a statement than a question on this. The issue with, could we mute the office, or there we go. Okay. I don't disagree at all with as far as the backflow permitters and everything, but in this issue with my experience and my family's experience for a lot of years, like let's focus on like the Boardman area. You have a tremendous amount of surface water that's in there that's obviously high in nitrates. Legally, I think a big part of the problem out there is actually well construction. There's I mean, legally out there, we're hitting the rock, and you're getting into consolidated basalt a lot of times within your 18 feet. So you can put your 20 feet of pipe in and seal that off. You'll go through a little bit more, and someplace between 20 and 60 feet, you're going to kind of run into some fractures that are making a really small amount of water. And I've had this conversation with Sean and a couple other people out of the Pendleton office as well, where it's super high in nitrates. And I don't think it's all necessarily ag, considering the map that started out this conversation shows the chemical depot, as well as right behind, just south of where the major problem is in Boardman, is the bombing range. But if you take pipe down in those wells and down to say 40 feet or 60 feet, but you got to be watching it, because we're drilling with more water than this formation's making. For a lot of years, whenever we'd construct wells like that, and my dad figured this out in like 78 or something, if we took pipe down farther, we'd have next to no nitrates, and then the well next door that only has 20 feet of pipe in it would be much higher in nitrates. And the bad thing about that is you get a bunch of wells that don't have enough pipe in them on the surface. Then it's eventually going. I realize it's eventually going to take out the entire aquifer, right? But the thing is I still have customers out there that I've called or have called me for a different situation. I'm like, hey, how are you? How's your well testing out? And they're like, oh, we're great, but all of our neighbors around us are in bad shape. And I tell them, I said, that's great. However, you're eventually going to have a problem, because the entire aquifer is going to be compromised eventually. And I don't disagree that there's not an ag aspect in it, but I think there's more to it than just blaming it all on the big farms in the area, because it's proven to us time and time again. And then the bigger problem from that is having complete transparency with all of your home landowners. And I think you're at like 40% in that area as far as compliance on getting anything, as far as getting their wells tested. Well, there's a lot of wells out there, hundreds, even thousands, well, there's thousands of wells, but there's hundreds of them that people may or may not even say that exist, because they don't want to They don't want to have to go decommission a well that they're bootlegging water out of, or whatever the case may be. But I think there's other areas that this, other avenues that this needs to be attacked in order to do that. And I don't know. And the next step, okay, seal through that aquifer and go down to the other aquifer. However, there's some commingling wells in the area, so it's going to nuke the lower aquifer, and drilling into that lower aquifer is even more difficult because there's a tremendous amount of clay interbed, which is a caving problem, nightmares for the drillers themselves. So in order to get down to, sometimes 300-400 feet, and right now most of those wells are testing good, they can, but there's going to be other issues in the future with this, and I don't think it's all going to be cured by. I question how much you're going to even notice a difference even after several years or so in the especially in the Boardman area. And then I could elaborate on out there off a diagonal and that area, which is a whole nother bag of worms as well. But
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. And you're not wrong. It's a bigger issue than just what we're seeing with the irrigation wells for sure. And we have looked at the well construction, especially in the Boardman area. Very much a concern for sure. At the end, we as you know, OWRD is usually water quantity, and so quality we're hoping to help out, but that's not necessarily our biggest purview from our department. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a big issue, and there's a lot of different caveats that we should be addressing. And yeah, the well construction is a big piece and where they all tap into. We are trying to get a well survey program underway to do a little bit more research and figure out that nitrate movement through the aquifer. But this is just one component that we can start with. So, and that's the one thing that OWRD can work with.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Brandon. First of all, thanks for the info and your observations. I appreciate that. Really appreciate you been sharing that with Sean as well. That's excellent. And some of that's gotten back already to us. And then, yeah, I just want to reiterate what Tessa just said, which is this is one component of the overall nitrate reduction plan that Chris had mentioned at the top of the presentation, and the one that, one of a few places where we can support the effort. But this is a lot of that nitrate reduction plan that the governor's office kind of organized is coming out of DEQ and OHA and Department of Ag. So other agencies involved as well. And I want to finally just agree with Brandon and reiterate it's a tough situation to figure out. If there's many sources out there that are all playing a role, and so it's a difficult problem. Good. All right. Tessa, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming by and providing input.
Okay, thank you guys.
So back to 10:15, had a break scheduled. Folks feel about that? Good. All right. Let's take a break and we'll come back in 15 minutes. We'll get started again at 10. Well, about this 13 minutes. We'll start at 10:30. Just a minute. Hate to break up the conversation.
Spend all day talking.
No, we could. We could.
Well, I would assume that have to take over the chair duties at this point. So that the next line item is committee reimbursement options, and that was taken off.
Yep.
So we're at Division 512 Harney Basin critical area.
Yeah, that's correct. So I gave a quick preface, beginning of the meeting, the first two presentations we saw, the ledge update and the start card fee update. Those are kind of standard annual advisories, and given that by June we'll be at the end of the long session, we'll have Bryn back to give us an update on what actually passed and what the future looks like, given anything that comes out of the legislature. This next item, Division 512 rulemaking, is an ongoing Harney Basin critical groundwater area designation. This committee has heard about the Harney Basin for a decade now. We bring anything groundwater related that's going in front of the commission, we always bring in front of the committee. And the reason we have these committee meetings, we decided on the Tuesday before the commission meetings, so they're going to happen Thursday, Friday this week, and our set meetings are always the Tuesdays before, is because by this point in time, the staff reports are out to the commission, and everything's pretty well set for what we're going to present to them. So we want to present to the committee first, so that if the committee has any advice to the commission or wants to kind of put that forward, that you can do so, and then we typically will take that advice and just incorporate it into the presentation to the commission later in the week. So just some background for the new folks on why we're meeting Tuesdays, and kind of how we want to make sure that we provide y'all with the opportunity to provide input on anything that you see. So that said, the 512 is an update. It's kind of an ongoing update, both to the committee and the commission. So the commission's not being asked to make any decisions at this point. When rulemakings are going on, as opposed to a general informational report, then the GWAC advice needs to occur within the public comment period. And so in the past, we've done it one of two ways. Either the regular meeting is within the public comment period and we just kind of do a longer session there. Sometimes the public comment period isn't aligned with the committee meetings, and we've added a meeting with just that one agenda item to discuss within that public comment period and provide kind of committee advice to the commission for them to consider. So any question just about the format and how we approach that? Okay. I am always happy to receive feedback on how the committee feels about how it operates and everything. So as we go along, if you think something else would be better, by all means, please bring it up and we can chat about it. All right. With that intro, I will turn it over to Tim and Jason. That'd be great.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah,
Did you
I'm
have
sorry. Yeah, if you could just give a quick introduction, you and Jason, so folks know who you are, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I'll stop sharing then so y'all can see us. So first off, my name is Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section here at the department, and I'm one of the staff working on this rulemaking. We've got Jason Spreed here and Kelly Mines. And Jason, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Kelly.
All right, thanks, Tim. My name is Jason Spreet. I'm the East Region Manager for Water Resources out of Baker City. So I manage the East Region, which encompasses the Harney Basin.
Thanks, Jason. Tim, Kelly Mines, the policy analyst and rules coordinator for this process.
Great. So a little background. We started this process back in Well, really, it started back in about 2016 with an update to these rules and a groundwater study that was initiated by the department. And then in April of 2023, we began a rulemaking advisory committee process to update these rules. And we have been going through a considerable amount of information with the RAC as we move towards rules. And Kelly will give you an update on where we are in that process at the end here. But as we go through this, I will do my best for the new folks, to put things in perspective and to bring you up to speed on what we've been looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll jump in. All right, so today we're going to talk through a few things here. I'm going to start out with talking about what we've learned related to management elements or dials through sensitivity runs. So we are using a groundwater model that was built by the USGS in collaboration with the department. And that model has essentially dials you can turn up or down to impact future water levels within the basin. And so we've done a lot of analysis over the past year using that model, and we're going to talk through what we've learned there. I also want to talk through the impacts that we are facing as we look at future management scenarios and how we manage groundwater pumping going forward. And then I want to try to put the modeling uncertainty into perspective as well, so that we're all on the same page about what these results are showing us and where we have more or less certainty in the model. We're going to talk through the management scenario that we proposed at the last rulemaking advisory committee meeting about a month ago. And then some feedback we've received from the RAC as we've gone through this entire process. And I want to put that RAC feedback in perspective of the dials that we're turning in that modeling work. And then Jason's going to run through implementation and adaptive management. So just a high level overview of how do we take what's in the rule language and how do we get to actual management on the ground? And then how are we trying to build in the ability to adapt our future actions based on conditions and how the groundwater level conditions change in the future. Kelly will run through fiscal impact, and then Kelly will also take us through next steps, including that timeline for the RAC meetings and public comment. So let's jump right in. So learning through modeling is what we've been doing for about the last year. The Harney Basin groundwater model was published in early 2024. It was based on the groundwater study that the department and the USGS collaborated on. It was about a 6-year study from start to publication. And since that model published, we have spent hundreds of staff hours building tools and actually running the model, and then processing model results and trying to put that into a framework that is understandable by a layperson, because our RAC members are certainly not groundwater modelers, and we don't expect them to be. So we need to make the information accessible to them. Our first approach with the modeling was to design scenarios and to test those with the model. So essentially, we would predefine what our parameters were, and then run them through the model and see what the results came out to be. With enough staff time and some pretty impressive work by Ben Scandella, our primary groundwater modeler, we changed over to a second approach, which was he built a piece of software that allowed us to identify the maximum pumping that could happen within a portion of the basin, while achieving the goal of stabilizing water levels based on parameters we set. So the first approach was just set up all the inputs in a really manual fashion and get results. And the second approach was, let's tell the model software what we want to have the end results be, and let's have it then figure out how much pumping can occur to have that outcome. And so in the most recent RAC meetings, we've been presenting on that second approach, and we've been using that approach to try to hone in on our final management scenario that we're going to propose in the rules. And then we've also used that software to perform sensitivity analysis to try to isolate and understand different variables. And we'll talk through what some of those variables have been and what we've learned. So to put it sort of into geography for you, here's a map from the model report. You can see up here, we've got Oregon. The Harney Basin is a good chunk of Harney County and a little piece of Grant County there. And in this map, all of the red area are the active model cells. So this is where we're actively making changes to groundwater pumping and experiencing or getting results related to groundwater levels. And then the broader blue area is the total model grid, and the blue cells are just simply not active within the model. So what we're looking at here is this, this red portion. Burns and Hines are right here, sort of in the middle of the basin. And then we've got Harney Lake, Malheur Lake, the Malheur Wildlife Refuge is down here to try to help put that in perspective for you. And we've got Highway 20 that runs from Bend on through Burns coming through here. So hopefully that helps you orient yourself geographically to what we're going to be talking about. So I'm now going to dive into what we've learned based on each dial within the model, or each sort of aspect management element that we can change. So I'm going to start out with the spatial extent. So I just talked about the map, and I will a little bit later on show you a map of how we've divided the basin into subareas. But what we've essentially learned related to dividing the basin into management areas, smaller management areas than the basin as a whole, is that more subareas means that we can generally have a larger permissible total withdrawal. And permissible total withdrawal is the rule term for how much pumping can happen under groundwater rights within the basin while we achieve our goal of stabilizing groundwater levels within the basin. So essentially, more subareas means less curtailment. And that's because we can target pumping reductions to the areas of most severe decline, and we can allow more people in areas with less decline to continue pumping. Sensitivity runs that we've then taken on to try to test out just how important are certain subareas. The Dog Mountain and the Weaver Springs subareas, we have tried combining them. We've tried splitting them apart. And splitting them has very little impact on the overall basin-wide curtailment, but it does have a pretty substantial impact on how curtailment is distributed between those two areas. So by splitting them, we're able to allow more pumping in the Dog Mountain subarea while holding the Weaver Springs subarea at a constant amount of curtailment. And then the other thing we've looked at here is the spatial variability of water levels rates of change between different subarea schemes. And I'll talk about why this matters in a moment. But whether we use 15 subareas or 6 subareas, so 15 smaller subareas or 6 larger subareas, the total amount of variability and water level rates of change spans about minus 0.5 feet per year and positive 0.3 feet per year. And what that essentially means is that regardless of how we're slicing the basin here, we're going to have, when we achieve stable groundwater levels, and that is being defined as a median groundwater level rate of change of 0. So that means half the wells are 0 or positive, and half the wells are 0 or negative rates of decline. That the two endpoints of our data set fall between minus 0.5 feet per year and plus 0.3 feet per year. So our actual, data set, when we're stable, shows that wells are not wildly different in their rates of change. So we don't have wells, when we reach stability at a median level, we don't have wells declining at, 2 feet or 3 feet per year or recovering at 2 or 3 feet per year. Most of our wells are right there around that median groundwater level trend of 0 feet per year. And so that's what we've learned really about the spatial extent. And so you'll see when we get to the proposed management scenario how that has affected our decision making. When we jump into the next dial is the success metric. So when I say success metric, I mean, how do we define what success is? We've said we want to stabilize groundwater levels. And what does that actually mean? And what we found is that more stringent success metrics, so say requiring 80% of wells to be at 0 rate of change or higher, results in higher final water levels within the basin, right? So we have more wells that are stable. That means higher final water levels, but it also means a smaller permissible total withdrawal, or said another way, more curtailment. So the more stringent we are on how we define success, the more curtailment that is needed to be imposed in order to achieve that success. And I think that makes sense, as we have to have less pumping in the basin in order to achieve true stability in more wells. Diving into the next management element here, or dial, we've got the timeline to achieve our goal. So we've tested out different timelines for achieving our goal, 10, 20, 30 years. And what we find is that shorter timelines to achieve the goal means higher final water levels in the basin. So the sooner we get to stability, the higher the final water level is going to be. And the sooner we get to our goal, the less impact there will be on springs and streams, natural evapotranspiration, so that's groundwater dependent ecosystems that can actually tap into groundwater, and less impacts on domestic wells. So fewer dry domestic wells, because higher final water levels means fewer dry wells. But it also means a smaller PTW, so again, more curtailment, and a shorter timeline to achieve the goal means we'd have less time for adaptive management. So the faster we get to our goal, the less opportunity we have to monitor the groundwater system, identify trends, and make changes in our management approach. So that's what we've learned around that timeline to achieve the goal. Looking at phasing of reductions. So we've talked about, how could we phase in reductions over a period of time as we work towards achieving the goal, so that we give people the opportunity for economic adjustment. We give people time to figure out how they're going to move forward as they lose access to water, and we are in a more water scarce environment in this basin. And phase reductions also allow us to be adaptive in our management. We can implement a change in total pumping. We can see how that impacts water levels, and then we can make future changes to pumping as we move towards our goal. So what we've learned around phasing of reductions is that shorter timelines for phasing reductions again means higher final water levels. So the faster we implement curtailment, the higher the final water level in the basin is going to be. We're also going to see less impact to springs and streams and to natural ET. So again, those groundwater dependent ecosystems that can use groundwater, and less impacts to domestic wells. But again, the shorter your timeline is, the less opportunity you have for adaptive management. And then around this phasing of reductions, we've done a few sensitivity runs to try to tease out a few specific things. So we've talked about having our phased approach implement curtailment rather than each year implementing curtailment, implement curtailment and then waiting a number of years until a checkpoint, and then implementing the next round of curtailment. And so we've looked at the frequency of checkpoints at 3, 6, and 9 years. And what we found is that regardless of whether we implement the curtailment on a schedule of every 3 years, every 6 years, or every 9 years, it has no impact on the final amount of curtailment that needs to be implemented, which means that we can essentially make a policy choice there and try to balance the adaptability with certainty for water users out there in the basin. So picking a timeline or a schedule for phasing in curtailment that makes sense for both the water users and for the department. And then another thing we've looked at is moving up the timeline for phasing in reductions in specific subareas, trying to provide additional relief to critical springs or potentially to domestic wells. And what we found is that by implementing more aggressive timelines in Weaver Springs, which is our most severe area of decline, and in Silver Creek, which is a area of groundwater flow and recharge to Weaver Springs, that provides additional benefit to some of the critical springs that exist near the southernmost portion of the Silver Creek subarea and just to the west of the Weaver Springs subarea. So we're considering more aggressive timelines in an area of most severe declines and in an area where we could see benefits to spring flow. And then we've also looked at front-loading curtailment. So instead of having our curtailment phased in equal quantities over the phase-in period, we looked at what does it mean, what would it look like to have, say curtailment scheduled in more upfront and less at the tail end. And, we've looked at something like, what if we implement 40% of the total curtailment that needs to happen in year 1, and then, at the next checkpoint, phase in maybe another 30, and then after that, maybe phase in 15 and 10 and 5, and finally, you're fully curtailed over the phase-in period. And what we found is that by front-loading curtailment, we reduce basin-wide impacts. So we get to higher final water levels. We see less impacts to springs and streams, to natural ET and to domestic wells. And we're still able to do adaptive management. We're just losing the quantity we can adapt as we get further down the schedule. And we know, from the start that it's going to take a pretty substantial amount of reduction in order to get to stable water levels. And so by front-loading curtailment, we can try to get there with less impacts to the non-ag communities and to the ecosystems. So diving into impacts, we've done some sensitivity runs trying to understand exactly, what's happening in specific areas of the basin, specifically around spring flow. And what we've identified is that Silver Creek is a critical contributor to spring flow in the Warm Springs Valley. There's a big complex of springs that discharges water to the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and that is a critical source of water for the refuge, for its operations and for all of the ecology that exists around that refuge. And so what we've identified is that curtailment in places other than Silver Creek is not helpful to protecting spring flow in that spring complex. Even Weaver Springs, where we have the most severe curtailment or the most severe declines, curtailing Weaver Springs substantially or maybe even fully does not provide the same benefit that reducing use in Silver Creek does to those spring complexes. We've also identified that Silver Creek, Sylvies, and Dog Mountain supply substantial amounts of groundwater to the Weaver Springs subarea. So if we're going to be filling in the Weaver Springs cone of depression there, the severe groundwater level declines, we're going to need water contribution from Silver Creek, Sylvies, and Dog Mountain. And so those areas around Weaver Springs also are going to need reductions in use in order to make water available to flow down into that Weaver Springs area. And then the last piece here is targeting only Weaver Springs for quick and substantial reductions provides very limited protection for spring flow. So we can't solve this problem simply by curtailing in one specific area of the basin. We need a more holistic approach. So that's what we've learned with relation to the different dials within the model that we can turn. And now I want to talk a little bit about model uncertainty. And a model is only as good as its inputs. And we have limited historic spring discharge measurements, but we have substantial historic water level measurements. And so as we worked with the USGS, we're very confident in the calibration of the model to groundwater levels. So we believe the model predicts groundwater levels going forward very well. But we're less confident in its calibration to spring discharge and ET. And in some areas, we're very uncertain about the calibration to spring discharge simply because of the lack of historic measurements and the inability to program those into the model effectively. And so while the model is really helpful for identifying what future outcomes look like, we want to be careful in not relying too much on the model. And so what we want to focus on instead is achieving higher final stable water levels, because those are going to result in fewer dry well impacts, less spring impacts, and less impacts to those groundwater dependent ecosystems. And so as we move forward with the RAC and proposing a management scenario, we're going to be focusing or trying to focus less on specific constraints around spring flow and ET and more around final water levels and getting to higher final water levels more quickly. So before I jump into the management scenarios, are there any questions from the folks in the room or online around what I've presented so far?
Tim?
Yeah.
From your modeling, what percentage of total volume of current usage has to be reduced in order to come to stability?
Yeah, so we'll get to that here in just a second. But it's somewhere between about 4 to 35% and about 40%. And that's based on 2018 estimated use. So.
And are those reductions coming from water rights, both surface and groundwater?
So there'd be no impact on surface water rights. We're looking at groundwater rights only. And it would be, permitted groundwater uses. So.
And are you doing it more on the newer water rights and preserving senior water rights?
Yeah, so so we'll be following the doctrine of prior appropriation. And so it would be junior water rights would be curtailed off first, and then senior water rights would be allowed to continue pumping.
Okay.
And we'll get into that a little bit more as Jason talks about.
I had a question. You had mentioned when you were looking at stable groundwater levels, you mentioned you were going to be looking at the median value for wells. Why the median value instead of the mean?
Yeah, so the median is less sensitive to outliers. So an individual well that might track wildly different from the rest of the wells in that subarea could have a much more substantial effect on the mean than on the median. And that's the primary reason we have proposed the median, and then the RAC has supported that as well. All right, so I want to jump into our proposed management scenario from RAC number 12, which I said was about a month ago. And in this table here, we've got the parameters on the left. So that's the dials or the management elements that I just talked about. And then on the right-hand side, we've got, what we actually proposed. And here you'll see that the spatial extent, we are focused on 7 subareas. So that's how we're proposing to divide the basin. The stability success metric is a median. So that means the 50th percentile. So basically a halfway point in the data. And we're doing that based on all well cells within the model. So it's not just a subset of wells. It's actually all wells in the model because we can actually measure that in the model. We've set the timeline to achieve our goal of stability at 30 years. So we want to solve this in 30 years time. For a phasing timeline, we want to take 24 years to implement the curtailment in full. The frequency of adaptation, so how often we schedule curtailment and how often we check in and potentially adjust that curtailment, would be every 6 years. And then at the last RAC meeting, we proposed some constraints on the model results around discharge to streams and springs, natural ET, and dry domestic wells. And as I said before, we have some uncertainty around these. And so we're likely to recommend dropping these and focusing solely on water levels. But for the last RAC meeting, we presented these as a way of gathering feedback on impacts to the groundwater system and how people are considering those as they provide us feedback. So jump ahead here. Here's our sub-area map. So exterior boundary here is our proposed critical area. The dark black lines are outline the 7 sub-areas. And then underlying that in the different colors is our original 15 sub-area proposal, which we have stepped back from after substantial conversation with the RAC. And in a bit, we'll talk about what that RAC feedback has looked like, and hopefully that'll help you understand why we've taken that step back from 15 sub-areas to 7. So here's the space we're looking at here. And as I've talked about, here's that Silver Creek subarea. The Weaver Springs subarea is right here. This is our area of most severe declines. And then we have, broad declines across much of the basin. And that spring complex we're talking about is right in here that we've focused on a lot. So when we look at the actual results, and we run the software to optimize and say, like, using those constraints that I just showed you, how much pumping can occur, in the basin. And it comes out that the model says it's about 82,800 acre feet. And that's a reduction of about 53,000 acre feet from 2018 levels, which is about a 38% reduction. And if we follow that management scenario, we allow this to continue. At 30 years, we'll achieve stability, but we'll have a reduction in lowland spring and stream flow as a percentage of 1980 numbers of 41%. So we're talking about a pretty substantial reduction in groundwater discharge to springs and streams. We'll have about a 28% reduction in lowland natural ET. So and that's based on 2018's numbers. It's a different point in time. And then the change in dry well count, we'll see about an additional 47 domestic wells go dry as compared to what was dry in the model in 2018. So a pretty substantial impact there on the domestic wells also. This scenario and the 38% reduction results in here's a couple of trajectories for groundwater levels, and this is the median groundwater level within each of these sub-areas. And I'm putting these up here as a sample to show you sort of some of the data we get with the model. So in the Silver Creek sub-area here, if we impose the curtailment we're talking about, the groundwater level in 2030, which is when we start curtailment in the model, we see the groundwater levels continue to decline as that curtailment is implemented and phased in. By about 2040, 2045, we start to hit, stability, but then groundwater levels actually rebound up. And that's because in order to protect spring flow in the model, we actually had to curtail more than what would result in stability. And we received some RAC feedback about this specific scenario to them, members of the RAC, looking like the department requiring recovery of groundwater levels rather than simply stabilizing groundwater levels. And that was, I think, a fair criticism. In other sub-areas, this is a completely different sub-area, the Silvies. The Silvies River flows out into this sub-area and acts as a pretty substantial area of recharge. In this sub-area, we see groundwater levels decline, again, slowly as curtailment is phased in. As curtailment is fully implemented, we see groundwater levels recover just a little bit, but never get back above, the original starting level. And so, this is a little bit clearer example of, sort of stabilization. But again, the amount of curtailment between these two sub-areas was also substantial. If I remember right, in Silver Creek, we were having to curtail at about 70% of groundwater use, 2018's groundwater use in that sub-area. And Sylvie's, we were only looking about 9 to 10% reduction. So depending on where you are in the basin, how close you are to areas of recharge, and depending on what the impacts are, the geology of your sub-area, the amount of reduction might be drastically different. So that's just some of the data we can show there, and that's what we presented to the RAC at the last meeting. And we got a whole host of feedback from RAC members over the last 2 years, but specifically around this most recent management scenario, and want to share some of that with you for your awareness of what the local people are thinking. So we've heard that our 15 sub-area approach may restrict the creation of voluntary agreements and successful market solutions. That's one of the key reasons we step back from the 15 sub-area approach, that we want to enable unique solutions to this problem that are voluntary and not just rely on regulation. We've heard that one sub-area, or just using the entire critical area as a whole and managing it as a whole, would honor prior appropriation more effectively. And so trying to balance that honoring of prior appropriation with trying to get them to the maximum amount of pumping possible, allowing market solutions. We sort of fell into this place where we looked at a 7 sub-area concept, and many RAC members have supported that concept through different comments there. We've also heard from specific RAC members that 15 sub-areas would allow for more targeted curtailment, which would allow basin-wide there to be more pumping, and that would have less economic impact on the basin, which is something that people care about greatly out there. And then we've also heard that there should be a process for adjusting sub-area boundaries in the future. And while we can't build that into the rules, that kind of boundary adjustment will require a rulemaking in the future if we're going to adjust those boundaries. Looking at the success metric, we've heard some feedback saying we should use a well-by-well approach or the mean. So we should look at only a specific subset of wells that we can actually measure, and we should use the mean instead of the median. Again, our concern around that has been that the mean could result in outliers dragging the data in one direction or another, where it could be the case that you have a single well recovering at a pretty rapid rate, while a good chunk of your wells, more than half, are still declining. But your mean would show that you're actually stable. We've heard that using the median of measured wells within a sub-area should be a success metric. And then we've heard that we should use a median of measured wells and include a limit on individual well declines. So not only does that group of individuals want us to achieve a median groundwater level rate of change of 0, but they also want to set some sort of threshold, say no well can exceed 1 foot of decline per year or something like that. And then we've also heard individuals advocate for a more strict success metric than the median or the mean, and say that we should use the 80th percentile and include a limit on individual well declines. And those folks are really clearly focused on returning the basin to a state where the fewest quantity of wells are declining in an individual year. With relation to our timeline to achieving the goal, we said had proposed 30 years. We've heard that it took a generation to create the problem, and we should take a generation to fix it. That's been a pretty consistent comment from the RAC, or portions of the RAC. And then we've also heard from groundwater users that 30 years is too long, since groundwater levels have been declining for a long time. And we have, evidence of declines starting in earnest as early as, 1990. And we have indications of decline going back even to the, 1970s. So it's a fair point that groundwater levels have been allowed to decline for a long time, and perhaps allowing another 30 years to resolve this problem and get to stable groundwater levels, isn't appropriate. With regards to the phasing timeline, how long we take to curtail, we've heard that 24 years is too long and 6 years would be better. They were very specific in that. Again, that's pointing to the need or the desire to achieve higher final stable water levels, and to resolve this problem sooner than 30 years. We've heard that Weaver Springs should be curtailed immediately. And one suggestion was a 75% reduction in the first 3 years. So the thought there being that Weaver Springs is sort of an outlier in the basin. It has the absolute most decline. It's a unique geology as compared to a lot of the rest of the basin. So we should treat it differently and curtail more rapidly. And we heard that again, that Weaver Springs should be on a different timeline, and that 24 years is too long. And on the flip side, we've heard that 24 years provides an economic adjustment period, and having that 6-year adaptation period increases certainty for water users. So if you know that you're going to be curtailed, but not for 6 more years, that gives you time to restructure your business, to make decisions about how you're going to approach, the coming curtailment. And perhaps you get through, one more cycle of alfalfa, or something like that, as you get ready to choose how to move forward, as you lose access to your groundwater rights. With relation to impacts to springs and streams, and natural ET, we've heard that protecting springs and streams is an element of preserving public welfare, health, and safety. There's specific statutes within the Groundwater Act that, essentially tell the department and the commission that we're supposed to be preserving the public welfare, health, and safety. And so they're advocating for springs and streams to be an element of that and to be considered in that. We've also heard that the highest percentage of springs and streams should be protected by immediate implementation. So again, people advocating for faster implementation of curtailment to achieve the maximum protection of springs and streams. We've heard, as we've acknowledged, the model has uncertainty, specifically related to the Double O Springs complex. That's down in that Warm Springs Valley that I mentioned earlier. And that's, really important. And then we've heard that setting thresholds for protecting springs and streams is not what the department has proposed as the goal of this process. We were pretty straightforward in how we proposed our goal of stabilizing water levels at the beginning, and we didn't mention or say anything about protecting springs and streams. And so the RAC members are rightfully calling out that that's not something that we said at the beginning, and they don't believe we should add it now as we get near the end of this process. And then related to impacts to domestic wells, we've heard that the department should not allow any more domestic wells to go dry. There have been dry domestic wells in the basin. It's impacting to people whose wells go dry, and we shouldn't allow it to happen again. We've heard this statute cited to us that says, and the RAC member said that this does not allow the department to elevate economic impacts and delayed curtailment over protecting domestic wells. And the department must assure adequate and safe supplies of groundwater for human consumption. So again, reiterating that domestic wells are important to the public welfare, health, and safety, and they're specifically called out in statute that we should be assuring those adequate and safe supplies of groundwater for human consumption. We've heard that domestic wells can also go dry because of poor well construction and depth, and so just considering groundwater levels as the reason for dry wells is not necessarily the whole story. And then we've also heard that, domestic well issues can be mitigated with funding. So there's a firm belief by some of the RAC members that dry domestic wells is a problem we can mitigate for. And so the rules and the curtailment shouldn't, we shouldn't constrain pumping solely to protect domestic wells. We should be trying to stabilize groundwater levels and get to sustainable use. And we can mitigate for any dry domestic wells that occur as we get to those levels. So that's the feedback we've heard from the RAC. And so we've then talked about how we're going to update the proposal. And likely at the next RAC meeting, we'll be proposing a management scenario and showing results for a management scenario that maintains the 7 subareas, continues to use the median for the success metric, continues to use a timeline to achieve the goal of 30 years with a 24-year phasing timeline. We're talking about changing that phasing time, the percentage and front-loading curtailment. As I said earlier, in our sensitivity analysis, we're able to see fewer impacts in the basin if we front-load curtailment, and so we're considering that. And then we're likely to continue to use the 6 years for the frequency of adaptation, or checkpoints is what we're calling them. And then we're going to remove the constraints as it relates to discharge to streams and springs, natural ET, and dry domestic wells. So that's how we're looking at updating our proposal. And likely at the next GWAC meeting, we'll be presenting the actual results of whatever that management scenario shows. So we'll have actual water level, modeled water level data to look at, and for this committee to consider. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and he's going to talk through the high levels of how we implement curtailment and then do adaptive management.
All right, thanks, Tim. So how we're going to implement the curtailment process is, as we're writing the rules, we're going to be setting the PTW, permissible total withdrawal, for each sub area in the basin that we've established. So those 7 sub areas that Tim talked about. And then we'll lay out the process for that adaptive management in those 6-year check-in periods. And then we will determine an actual use on how we allocate water to each right. So our original thought was that we would look at historical data on actual use that Tim mentioned in 2018, how many acre feet are used by each water right, and then allocate based on that actual use to each water right. What we're considering now is doing a more blanketed approach where we look at the basin or each sub area as a whole and determine the use in that sub area based on just previous data that we have on actual use, plus what we're hearing from the community, the actual use means. We found that it looks like in some of our earlier data, folks were deficit irrigating, and maybe only because they could only get so much water out of their points of appropriation or their wells on their water right, or for other reasons they may be using less water than what the actual crop needs were. So we're looking into that, but our thought is that we would allocate to each sub area or each or more broadly across the basin. It becomes a much better management tool if we have a more static number for users across larger swaths, rather than just determining actual use and allocating that for each individual right, which becomes a bit of a logistical nightmare there. And then once we do that, we will schedule those reductions over those 6-year check-in periods. And then we'll prepare orders that will say each user is allocated a specific amount and will be shut off over time through those 6-year periods, except for the seniors that will continue to be on after all of the curtailment has been initiated there. So we will write up those orders. We'll go to contested case. Those once we get through the contested case, we'll modify as we need to, and then those orders will regulate folks back, and we will have our staff there on the ground in Harney County, in the Burns area, regulate back, make sure that we check and that everybody is regulated back to their proper curtailment amount as we move forward. So each check-in period will have to do that check and regulate folks back. And then as we go through those 6-year periods, we can adaptively manage by, we'll be letting folks know when they're going to be shut off, and then we will, we can adjust appropriately as we, monitor the trend going forward. Next slide, please. And so that's what this sort of explains. This adaptive management plan that Kelly put together explains how we adaptively manage. So every 6 years, we conduct a groundwater level analysis, and we check to see if we are still on trend or not on trend. And then as we go through that, we go through this 30-year period, this 24-year curtailment period, but 30 years to get to zero decline or to get to the goal. And so as long as we still have curtailment or PTW in these sub areas to curtail to, we'll continue to move forward on that as we check through the adaptive management. So the evaluation period there you see that's in the tan color, that's when we actually evaluate the trends that we're seeing based on the data that we've collected between each check-in period. And then we get to the adjust period, where for each sub area, we check to see if they are on the expected trend based on model results. If they are inside that expected trend, which, we're that inside the expected trend, what that means is if we're between about the 25th and 75th percentile, we stay on trend or stay on the actual expected schedule for curtailment for each 6-year period. If we are higher than the expected trend, meaning the water levels are higher than we expected them to be at that time, and they are above the 75th percentile, between 75 and 90%, then we will reduce the scheduled curtailment for the next check-in period by about 50%. And then if they're even higher than that, above 90th percentile, then we will, decrease by 100% for the next check-in period. So we can adaptively manage in that way, allow people to continue to pump if we stay within our trend or above our trend. If we're below the trend, the opposite happens. Between the 75th and 90th percentile, we'll increase the curtailment by 50%. And if we're below the 90th percentile, we'll increase by 100%. So we could actually double the amount of curtailment expected based on the actual where we are on the trend that we see based on the data that we analyzed in the first phase there. Once we get through that and make our adjustments, then we announce to the community what those adjustments are going to be. And then we actually go forth and regulate or implement further curtailment from that point. And the amount of curtailment was about, as I described, between those percentiles. And then we go back to the beginning of the chart and go through that process again until we get through the 24 years of curtailment, or the 30 years of expected time that we think it will take to get to zero decline. All right, next. So here I'll turn it over to Kelly to talk more about the fiscal impact.
Thanks, Jason. Next slide there, Tim. Yeah, so the next slides, we're going to be talking about the fiscal impact, what our analysis is looking like, and kind of how we got here up to WAC number 12. But before we do that, just briefly setting the table. So as we got further into this conversation with the WAC and with the community through discussion groups, there became a request of OWRD should hire a independent economist to evaluate what groundwater reductions will do like an economic analysis. And we started hearing that around before rack number 11 and even prior to that. And so OWRD was responsive to those comments and requests. And we hired Echo Northwest to conduct a physical impact. And in our last racks, rack 11 and 12, they presented their methods for assessment in rack number 11 and number 12. They kind of presented them preliminary results. We're going to be primarily focusing today on those preliminary results. Next slide there. So the ask of Echo Northwest was to do two things. One was to conduct an economic analysis using existing information, conduct interviews for the local to gain with local residents to gain local information, and then running the in-plan model for economy-wide effects. And we also asked them to understand how different groundwater management scenarios might have different economic impacts. So just at a very high level, when we are talking about the M plan, and I am a non-economist, so we're going to keep this at a high level. The M plan model really evaluates how money moves through the economy. And it does this by looking at three different types of impacts. One would be the direct impacts. So that's things like impacts of expenditures by water, specifically from ag. So we're talking specifically ag and irrigation there for direct impacts. Then we have the indirect impacts. Those are the suppliers of the agriculture economy. So we're looking at fuel, fertilizer, seed, and equipment and stuff like that. And then induced impacts. This is more at the household level. It's spending directed indirectly associated with water use. So household to business effects. And how M-Plan measures those impacts is through one, the output, so the value of goods and services produced, jobs, the average number of employees employed, full-time or part-time, and also by personal income. So sum of employee compensation and proprietary income. It's important to note that M-Plan is how do I put this? Evaluates at a specific time. So if you tell the model to run, tells what it's going to look like 30 years, it's going to tell you the impacts specifically at 30 years. Next slide there. So using M-Plan, they established an economic baseline using M-Plan, the information that they gathered in the interviews. They've established an economic baseline which they're going to use to measure the impacts of groundwater reductions, specifically to the agricultural sector, the economy as a whole, so that's M-Plan, and then local government. And so we're going to kind of go through the agricultural sector and the local government here and what their preliminary results show. So for the preliminary results, we are seeing right now a sort of a one-to-one relationship for the reductions in the economy. So meaning if we're reducing groundwater use by 10%, we will see a 10% reduction to the overall economy. Two main reasons why we are seeing this one-to-one relationship in the ag economy is one, the basin is an isolated economy and it is highly dependent on agricultural. Two, that it is a monocropped economy and that monocrop is highly dependent on water. Next slide, please. In terms of impacts to local government revenue, it's a little bit different here. So we're not really seeing that one-to-one relationship. And the reason why is that the local government at a very high level kind of collects the county tax assessor assesses land based off of a value. So you have land class 2, that's a land that's fully irrigated. You have a land class 3, that's some irrigation, and then a class 5, which is fully curtailed. So even if a particular parcel or irrigated land is fully irrigated, they'll still be collecting tax revenue. So we're not seeing that one-to-one reduction. We're seeing a little less than the one-to-one. And also kind of note too, so during our rack number 12, there was a comment that the analysis of Echo Northwest missed ranching. Ranching. No, what's the word? Jason, Tim, what's the word I'm thinking of?
Livestock.
Thank you, livestock. Yes. They missed the livestock analysis. So Echo has found a way to include livestock in their analysis. They have not yet told me their findings yet. We have a meeting coming up here, so we'll know that before our April 2nd meeting. And then the last impacts, next slide, that they looked at in more of an empirical analysis is the impacts to the ecosystems. And one, they found that springs support base flow in the most protective parts of the refuge. So they focused around the 00 spring. So that's that spring complex that Tim pointed out. They found that direct impacts on recreation from changes in groundwater management are likely minimal. And then they found it hard to separate impacts to the Pacific Flyway. So for reference, the Malheur Life Refuge is part of the Pacific Flyway. A lot of migratory birds go through there every year. And it's hard to kind of draw what groundwater reductions would do for impacts to the Pacific Flyway, mainly because these birds experience other impacts to them along the way. So we can't really draw a relationship there. And then livestock, groundwater dependent ecosystems are potentially affected. So stock water, wetland habitat, migratory bird populations, fish and amphibian populations, depending on springs and stream flows, are potentially affected by scenarios via ecosystem services. So if groundwater reductions keep going down, then they could potentially be impacted, is what they're trying to say there. And then another analysis that we have done is impacts to domestic wells. This is more of an OWRD analysis because we had more internal knowledge. And we took 14 different grants from the Harney County from the Harney Domestic Well Fund and the Well Fund and Well Abandonment Replacement Repair. And we found that the total average cost for a total well replacement is $24,987. The maximum cost would be $39,980, and the minimum would be $8,700. And what we plan on doing for the assessment to domestic wells is we will be taking the number of wells that we estimate to go dry within our management scenario model run and multiplying it by the average, the maximum, and the minimum. And we'll be comparing that to the USGS continued pumping scenario, the amount of domestic wells anticipated to go dry at the end of 30 years. So that's our plan for impacts to domestic wells. And then our next steps here for the physical impact is that Echo Northwest will run the analysis for the OWRD's management scenario. That's the one we'll be talking about with you next GWAC. And then OWRD will assess impacts to domestic wells. We'll run a physical impact analysis on SWAMPA implementation and also our classification implementation. So that's all the physical impact. I guess going to pause there and if there's any questions.
Jason? What kind of percentage do you have on cooperation that already has flow meters on irrigation wells?
We are assessing, so that's part of our SWAMPA. It's a good question. Right now, we're assessing how many water rights, because within the basin, there are already water rights that have flow meters required to, mostly the juniors. So we're assessing how many water rights need to install flow meters. So we're looking into that right now, but I do not have that on hand.
I go back, I happen to live in a critical groundwater area, and when it was imposed, there was no difference between young or recent rights and senior rights. Everybody had to install a meter. And it really gave a quick picture of what was going on so that the usage was really tied down immediately. all the users were required to file annual reports showing their usage and their projected usage for the following year. And it really gave good information really quickly.
Yeah, I think I might have misunderstood your question. So anyone within the SWAMPA boundary, it doesn't matter seniority, is going to be required to install a flow meter to get that picture of how much water is coming out each year.
Good.
Yeah, so sorry, I misunderstood you.
Oh, well, I didn't ask it properly. It was my fault.
So I'll also add to that, the Harney area is quite a bit larger than Cooper Hole Mountain. We're looking at.
And different structure.
Sure, yeah. So I'll ask folks to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're looking at about 650 groundwater rights, but there's multiple wells on rights, and so we're looking between, well, up to maybe 1,400 wells that are listed on those rights. So is that fair enough, round numbers? I'm seeing nods. That's good.
Yeah.
So it's going to be pretty sizable, and even getting reporting from all those and then getting it organized, that's going to, turn into a job. So so we're trying to be thoughtful about how that all plays in. And so just noting that.
My point is that the more accurate information you have and the quicker you get it, the better decisions you can make.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Just a quick question about the wells that are going to be reviewed for the trend analysis every 6 years. Is that a set collection of wells, monitoring wells, domestic wells, and is that set stay the same, or how many and which wells are monitored every 6 years?
Yeah, so the intent is to continue our observation well network, which we measure quarterly. Some of those wells have, data loggers in them, and they record even more frequently than that. But for the purposes of this, we'll be looking at our observation well network, as well as all permit condition static water level required wells. So any well that has a permit condition that requires a static water level measurement to be reported to the department will be considered. And we will then be doing data quality assurance on those wells to make sure that we're not using anomalous data. And we've done this analysis or a very similar analysis once, or actually a couple times for during the RAC process. And the analysis is actually available on our website in the rulemaking page. So you can take a look at, what we've been able to assess by subarea. We haven't talked about any really more strict requirement for static water level measurements by well. So be a subset of wells within each subarea that actually get measured, primarily permit condition wells, and then the department's observation well network. That answer your question, Robin?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Looks like we're good. Appreciate the input. Thank you much.
Hey, thank you very much. So now I want to get in, kind of give you an overview of the rulemaking timeline. What's it going to look like going forward into year 2025? As said a couple of times now, we have 2 more racks in this process. So that's going to be on April 2nd, then May 15th. On May 15th will be our last and final rack. We'll begin public comment June 1st, and then having 3 public hearings in August in the basin, August 4th through 6th. So that's going to be in Seneca, Burns, and Hines. We are planning some more initial engagement in the basin. We're not just going to do these public hearings. So come the next GWAC, we'll have a plan and we'll let you guys know what that plan is and what engagement looks like. And then public comment is going to be ending here August 7th. Then from August 8th on to November 26th, we go radio silent and prepare the draft staff report to our governing body, the Water Resources Commission. This is where we will look at all the comments and make changes to the rules based off of comments and address comments received. From there, on the November 26th, the final draft report is posted online for the public to see. And then come November 11th or 12th, we'll be asking our commission to adopt these rules. Next slide. I guess point of order here, Justin, I think during the next GWAC, we're going to have the public comment period going. So we'll probably need to coordinate and send them the rules and the notice so we can get some comments. So just a thought I had. Thank you. Okay, so expected topics next in our April meeting. I think Tim kind of did a great job hammering home, but we're going to be talking about our management scenario. Jason talked about the implementation, and we're going to talk about adaptive management. We will have our critical groundwater draft rule language written up for them to review and accept comments. And then we're working on the physical impact, which is going to include the critical groundwater area, so Echo Northwest analysis. It's going to have SWAMPA and also classification analysis as well. And then in May meeting, we're just looking at the proposed rule language for SWAMPA and classification in the critical groundwater area, giving them one last time as a RAC to provide comments, not one last time to provide comments, because they're welcome to go to the public comment period. And then we'll also be discussing that physical impact statement. And that was it. That was all I had for you in terms of the rulemaking. So I guess we open it. I'll throw it back to Justin in the room.
Any other questions on the timing? All right. So thanks for flagging, Kelly, that our next meeting, it sounds like, is June 10th. That'll be toward the beginning of the public comment period. But sounds like we'll have kind of full rulemaking packet that we'll get to you folks as early as possible. And I'm not sure, Kelly, I'm sorry, I might have missed it. Did that timeline have a time for the rulemaking packet to be completed?
It'll be noticed June 1, so it'll be done by June 1.
It'll be done by June 1, okay.
Yeah.
So that'll only be 10 days ahead of time. Like I said at the beginning of this, if that's not enough time or we decide we need more conversation, we can always add another meeting within that public comment period, which I think ended August
6th. Yeah. It's about 2 months. Yeah.
Yeah. So just want to note that that's an option if we feel that's necessary. So. All right.
All right. Thank you three very much. Very informative. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Looks like that brings us to public comments.
Public comments. So just noting we don't have any public in the room. Doesn't look like anybody online is somebody other than a GWAC member or a department person.
That makes it pretty simple.
Sure. Any other comments from the members?
One for me is I appreciate the group getting together here where we can meet face to face, introduce ourselves, little chat outside of the meeting itself, so forth, so we get to know each other a little bit. I really appreciate that, and I thank you all for coming. Other than that, I think we're ready to adjourn. Unless Justin?
Nothing further. No.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second. And moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
We're done.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, you were talking about groundwater area.